There's a pattern in history so consistent, so predictable, that once you see it, you can't unsee it. From the marble halls of ancient Rome to the banking towers of modern America, every empire that tried to finance its greatness with borrowed money has followed the exact same path to collapse. The pattern has a name among economists: the doom loop. It's not a conspiracy theory or a political opinion. It's a documented feedback mechanism that has destroyed the financial foundation of every major power that has ever existed. And right now, in real time, we're watching it unfold again. The numbers are there, the trajectory is clear, and history has already written the ending. The doom loop is deceptively simple in its mechanics, which is precisely what makes it so dangerous. It begins when a government discovers it can't fund its ambitions through taxation alone, so it starts borrowing money by issuing bonds or debasing currency. At first, this seems to work perfectly. The empire expands, infrastructure gets built, armies get paid, and citizens prosper. But here's where the trap springs shut. As debt grows, interest payments consume an ever larger share of government revenue. To make those payments, the government must borrow even more, which increases future interest obligations. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where debt growth accelerates exponentially, not linearly. The government faces an impossible choice: dramatically cut spending, massively raise taxes, or debase the currency through inflation. Each option carries catastrophic consequences, but the laws of mathematics don't care about political considerations. The feedback loop intensifies as creditors lose confidence. They demand higher interest rates to compensate for increased risk, which makes the debt burden grow even faster. Eventually, the government reaches a point where it's borrowing money just to pay interest on existing debt, not to fund armies, infrastructure, or anything productive. At this terminal stage, the empire has entered what economists call a debt spiral, where the mathematics of compound interest make collapse inevitable regardless of any policy response. This is the doom loop pattern, and it has never been defeated. The Roman Empire provides the textbook example of the doom loop in action, and the precision of their own records allows us to track the exact progression. In the 1st century CE, under Augustus, the Roman denarius was minted at 95 to 98% pure silver. This wasn't arbitrary. It was the foundation of Rome's monetary credibility and its ability to maintain the largest empire the world had ever seen. But maintaining that empire was expensive. Military expenditures, constant border wars, elaborate public works, and an increasingly complex bureaucracy all demanded funding that tax revenue couldn't cover. Emperor Nero, facing these pressures, in 64 CE, made a fateful decision. He reduced the denarius to about 94% silver content. It seemed like a small change, barely noticeable to the average Roman citizen. What followed was a masterclass in how the doom loop accelerates. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the late 2nd century, the denarius had dropped to approximately 75% silver. During the crisis of the 3rd century, from 235 to 284 CE, the debasement went into freefall. By 270 CE, the denarius contained less than 5% silver, down from 95% just 3 centuries earlier. The economic consequences were catastrophic and precisely predictable. As the currency lost value, prices skyrocketed in what historians now recognize as hyperinflation. Citizens who had saved in denarii saw their wealth evaporate. Trade networks collapsed because merchants couldn't trust the currency. Tax revenue plummeted in real terms, even as the government minted more coins, because people weren't idiots. They understood their money was being devalued. The empire entered the terminal phase of the doom loop. Rome couldn't pay its armies with worthless coins, so soldiers stopped fighting. It couldn't maintain infrastructure, so roads and aqueducts fell into disrepair. Border provinces were abandoned because garrisoning them cost more than they generated in taxes. The Western Roman Empire didn't fall to barbarian invasion. It dissolved because it could no longer afford to exist. The doom loop had run its full course. Spain's collapse provides an even more dramatic example because it happened despite possessing the largest treasure fleet the world had ever seen. When Spanish conquistadors discovered massive silver deposits in Potosi and Mexico in the 1540s, Spain suddenly controlled an estimated 80% of the world's silver production. Philip II inherited what should have been an unassailable economic position. Instead, he inherited a doom loop already in motion. In 1557, just 1 year into his reign, Philip II was forced to declare Spain's first sovereign default, the first in recorded history. This wasn't because Spain was poor. The silver fleets were arriving on schedule with tons of precious metal. Spain defaulted because the cost of servicing existing debt exceeded the crown's ability to pay, even with New World treasure. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Philip II would default again in 1560, 1575, and 1596, 4 sovereign defaults in 40 years. Each default raised the interest rates creditors demanded for future loans, which accelerated the next default. Between 1550 and 1650, Spain experienced the price revolution. with inflation rising by approximately 300 to 400% as silver flooded into the economy faster than real goods could be produced. Here's the counterintuitive lesson that makes the doom loop so insidious. More money made Spain poorer. The massive silver influx created inflation that destroyed the purchasing power of Spanish currency and devastated domestic manufacturing. Why produce goods in Spain when you could buy them cheaper from Dutch or English merchants? Spanish industry withered, unemployment soared, and the economy hollowed out despite, or rather because of, unprecedented precious metal wealth. By 1640, Spain was effectively bankrupt despite still controlling the world's largest treasure fleet. The empire fragmented, losing Portugal, the Netherlands, and its dominant position in Europe. Spain had discovered that you cannot finance empire indefinitely with debt, even if you control the money supply itself. The Weimar Republic's hyperinflation of 1923 demonstrates how quickly the doom loop can reach terminal velocity in a modern economy. After World War I, Germany faced enormous reparations payments imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, 132 billion gold marks, or approximately 6.6 billion British pounds. The German government couldn't raise this through taxation without triggering revolution, so it turned to the printing press. The numbers tell a story of exponential acceleration that defies comprehension. In early 1922, $1 was worth 160 German marks, already significantly devalued from the pre-war rate of 4.2 marks per dollar. By July 1922, prices had risen 700%, and hyperinflation had arrived. By November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion German marks, a devaluation factor of 1 trillion in less than 2 years. The doom loop's feedback mechanism operated at light speed. The government needed to make reparations payments and fund basic operations, so the Reichsbank monetized government debt by printing money. This caused inflation, which reduced the real value of tax revenue, which forced more money printing. By 1923, only 0.8% of government expenses were covered by tax revenue. The rest came from the printing press. The social consequences were apocalyptic. A loaf of bread that cost 160 marks at the end of 1922 cost 200 billion marks by late 1923. Workers were paid twice a day and would sprint to stores to buy goods before prices rose again. People who had saved their entire lives in German marks saw their wealth become literally worthless. Fortunes couldn't buy a single meal. The middle class was wiped out, creating the social instability that would eventually bring Hitler to power a decade later. The Weimar hyperinflation ended in November 1923 when Germany introduced the Rentenmark and completely abandoned the old currency. The lesson was clear. Once the doom loop reaches terminal velocity, the only solution is to completely reset the monetary system, a process that always involves massive wealth destruction and social upheaval. The United States is currently executing the same pattern with remarkably similar characteristics, just on a scale that would have been incomprehensible to previous empires. As of December 2025, the U.S. national debt stands at $38.4 trillion, an increase of $2.23 trillion in just 1 year. The debt-to-GDP ratio has reached 121%, exceeding the previous peak of 106% set during World War II. But the absolute numbers only tell part of the story. The doom loop mechanics are visible in the interest payment trajectory. In fiscal year 2020, net interest payments on the debt totaled $345 billion. By fiscal year 2025, that figure had reached $970 billion, nearly 3 times larger in just 5 years. Interest payments now consume 19% of all federal revenue and exceed spending on national defense. Here's where the exponential mathematics become unavoidable. The average interest rate on U.S. debt has risen from 1.64% 5 years ago to 3.41% today, more than doubled. Every percentage point increase in interest rates adds hundreds of billions to annual interest costs because the debt base is so enormous. The Congressional Budget Office projects interest costs will reach $1.6 trillion by 2034, consuming over 20% of all federal spending. The Federal Reserve's role in this doom loop is critical and often misunderstood. Between 2008 and 2022, the Fed's balance sheet expanded from $800 billion to $8.9 trillion, an 11-fold increase, as it monetized government debt through quantitative easing. From a peak of $8.9 trillion in June 2022, the Fed has reduced its balance sheet to $6.5 trillion through quantitative tightening, but that's still 8 times larger than before the 2008 financial crisis. This is debt monetization by another name. The government issues bonds, the Federal Reserve creates money to buy those bonds, and the resulting inflation acts as a hidden tax on everyone holding dollars. It's the same mechanism Rome used when debasing the denarius, just with digital ledgers instead of physical coins. The mathematics of the doom loop are merciless and apolitical. When interest payments exceed 20% of federal revenue, a government faces what economists call a debt spiral, borrowing money primarily to service existing debt rather than fund productive activities. The US is projected to cross this threshold within the next decade at current trajectories. 3 potential outcomes exist, and history shows us examples of each. First, the government could attempt to inflation away the debt, as Weimar Germany did. This means letting inflation run significantly higher than interest rates, so the real value of debt shrinks. The problem is that this destroys savers, devastates fixed income retirees, and typically spirals into hyperinflation as people lose faith in the currency. Second, the government could attempt austerity, massive spending cuts and tax increases to run budget surpluses and pay down debt. This was attempted by various European countries during the 2010s debt crisis. The political reality is brutal. Cutting spending by the trillions of dollars required would mean slashing Social Security, Medicare, defense, and virtually every government program simultaneously. No democracy has ever voluntarily imposed this level of austerity on itself. Third, and most likely, is a debt restructuring or default. This could be explicit, where the government announces it won't pay its debts in full, or implicit, where it changes the terms of bonds or inflates the currency. Either way, bondholders take losses, which triggers a crisis of confidence in government debt markets globally. The international dimension cannot be ignored. The US dollar's status as the global reserve currency has allowed America to borrow at lower rates than any other nation with comparable debt levels. Foreign holders own approximately $7 trillion of US Treasury securities. If confidence in America's ability to service its debt erodes, foreign creditors will demand higher yields or stop buying treasuries altogether. This would force interest rates higher, accelerating the doom loop exponentially. Historical precedent suggests that the transition happens not gradually, but suddenly. Spain defaulted 4 times in 40 years, despite enormous wealth. Weimar hyperinflation went from concerning to catastrophic in less than 18 months. Rome debased its currency gradually for centuries, then collapsed within a generation. The doom loop's terminal phase is characterized by nonlinear acceleration. Things seem manageable until very suddenly they aren't. Here's the insight that most analysis misses. The doom loop isn't primarily an economic problem. It's a mathematical and political problem. The mathematics are straightforward. Compound interest on an expanding debt base will eventually exceed any plausible level of revenue. The politics are equally straightforward. No democratic government will voluntarily impose the level of austerity required to escape the trap. This creates a paradox. Everyone with basic arithmetic skills can see the trajectory. Federal Reserve officials, Treasury secretaries, and congressional budget analysts all understand these numbers. Yet the system continues on its current path because the political incentives make change nearly impossible. Cutting spending alienates voters who benefit from programs. Raising taxes alienates everyone else. Inflation is invisible to most people until it's too late. The contrarian insight is this. The doom loop doesn't fail because of stupidity or lack of understanding. It fails because the mathematical endpoint is politically impossible to prevent within democratic systems. Every generation believes this time is different because we're smarter. We have better monetary policy, or we have economic tools previous empires lacked. Rome thought its military might make it invincible. Spain thought its silver made it rich. Weimar thought it could manage the money supply more carefully. They were all wrong for the same reason. You cannot borrow indefinitely at compound interest. The mathematics don't care about military power, natural resources, or monetary policy sophistication. Every empire that has tried this experiment has ended the same way. Not because they wanted to, not because they were incompetent, but because the doom loop's internal logic is inexorable once certain thresholds are crossed. The pattern has held for 3,000 years of recorded history. The burden of proof rests on those who believe this time will be different. And so far, the pattern remains undefeated. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, we're hearing a very familiar verse.